Hello, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to speak with you today. I'm aware I've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to give you a very high level insight into what we do at Human City and some findings from recent research into young people's housing experiences. So, on to the context. We're facing a crisis. It's no longer easy for young people on low middle incomes to find affordable accommodation in global cities. They are being pushed further and further out of the centre of cities. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you a bit about Human City, give you an overview of our research into young people's housing experiences, particularly in large cities, and leave you with things to think about when designing affordable housing. Human City, who are we and what we do? So why we exist to help local authorities and development teams to improve the quality of the built environment. How? We enable them to identify and invest in developments that bring clear public benefit, i.e. we offer guidance on innovation design at the building design stage and strategic briefing. What? We bring our perspective as applied anthropologists to ask what is social value in this context and establish ways to quantify it. To date, we've done a lot of research on and evaluation of co-living spaces in London. And this was most frequently posed as affordable or low-cost housing option for young people. And I'll return to this at the end with a few comments. Tales of Four Cities. So against a background for a need for affordable or low-cost housing in global cities and the emergence of solutions such as co-living spaces, we decided to do a bit of research into young people's experiences of housing to provide our clients with some evidence to develop new products. We focused on four cities, mainly because these were cities in which members of Human City were already spending significant amounts of time. So we happened to be in these places of New York, Dublin, London and Cape Town over a fixed period of time. Nevertheless, we understand that residents in these cities are experiencing similar challenges. There's an issue with these cities being landlocked. Cities like London, but also places like Cape Town are landlocked. There are only two ways to get into and out of these cities, and quite often that means that they are experiencing rush hour traffic, etc., and obviously higher densities. There's an issue of semi-migration. Many cities are absorbing talent from places that are external to the city and providing jobs for people at the early stages of their career. And so there are many interests and attractions for graduates in cities. So lots of migration happening to cities. And also there's the issue with the emergence of solutions and or leisure offers such as Airbnb. And you can imagine in a city if a large amount of the housing stock is absorbed or taken off the market in this way, that has a huge impact on rental prices. So this is just to give you an indication that the spaces that we asked about, didn't spend time in because this was very much in context mobile research, so obviously engaging with our with residents at a distance from where they live, but asking them about where they live. So accommodation in Dublin, Cape Town, London and New York. We carried out 12 hours of interviews, and that's 3 people per city, most people between the ages of 22 and 33, sorry. Most owned, 2 owned property. Some of one couple part owned and the other fully owned, and these were older individuals. 2 rented with friends. So this was friends, small groups of 2 or 4. One was living in a co-living space. This individual was on the younger end of the spectrum. 3 of the people we interviewed were still living with their families. 2 were living in London and 1 was in Dublin. The average age of the group of people we interviewed was 26, and they lived at a distance around 40 minutes from where they worked. So we were interested in their drivers or motivations, what was influencing their decisions. So these people young people were born at a very competitive time, mostly coming of age in the financial crisis, 2008, And so expressed really a kind of focus on their career, very career focused and ambitious group of individuals. Many had either left or at a point of leaving their family home, maybe a little later in life, and or were shifting from student accommodation into independent living and were determined to find their feet and live autonomously. Many were concerned with being part of something bigger. So it wasn't just about them as individuals, it was about contributing to society in a meaningful way, and many considered themselves to be part of wider global movements. So I'm keen to dismiss the stereotypes up front. Whilst younger people are flexible, obviously express best flexibility, are well known for their sociability and emphasis on experience and transformation. Actually, the group of people we interviewed were actually shifting towards the other end of the spectrum. So many had interests in something more permanent. They wanted to define and create habits and routines that locked them in place. Many were looking for familiar spaces and networks to be part of, so weren't transitory, were very much rooted in a particular community. And many of them, while being sociable, actually were at a point of their life where they're looking for alone time, some seclusion and separation from the crowd. So let's dig into this in a little bit more detail. Familiar networks. For this young group of people, networks are very important, as is familiarity. So they prioritised living in familiar locations in the city, close to people where they already know, or close to people, or migrate to areas where they know people who already live there. So there is very much an emphasis on living in familiar places amongst familiar people. They're interested in genuine value. So value for money is important. It's not necessarily about spending less. It's about spending where it matters most to them. So a nice space is important. Very prepared to pay a little bit more for a good designed space. A space that's particularly modern and efficient. So an interest in spatial efficiency and ergonomics and convenience of living. Criteria 3, many of them were actually interested in a quiet routine. So while sociable, they wanted solitude and quiet away from the crowds and wanted downtime, spaces to reflect and to relax, and looking for their little niche in the city, what they would call a haven. And of course, generic interest in green space. Many people living in high density areas are craving for access to outdoor and green spaces. So a need to bring that back into their domestic environment. So maximising value. So at Human City, how do we use this insight to help our clients deliver value, both financial but also social value in the context of these emerging needs? So we would recommend that housing solutions will differ between cities and cultures due to variation in social norms. People in Dublin are more likely to live with family for longer, perhaps until they get married, and then they'll move into their family home. So it's important to realise that every market is different and that one solution in one market won't necessarily seamlessly overlay onto another market. So that means that there's a requirement for in-context research. Housing solutions for the international market will potentially differ from solutions for the domestic market. So we know that there are individuals who travel around the globe, particularly those that are digitally nomadic, and the solutions for those groups will be different from the solutions for the domestic market. And that's really what we discovered, that those individuals that we interviewed were very much more living more locally, and were prioritising other things. So internationals are most likely to live in co-living spaces because they don't have the option of living at home or with close friends, whereas the domestic market is less inclined to live in co-living spaces. Housing solutions will need to work for people on low middle incomes as well as high earners. So current style housing solutions are still unaffordable, and potentially inaccessible to individuals who've just moved out of home or left university for their first job. So notably, many of the housing solutions proposed in recent years were not ones that the people we interviewed had found particularly useful or accessible to them. Thank you very much for your time.